Psalm 1, 2, 22, 23, 24, 47, and 68. Psalm 1:6 ends with this famous statement, the Lord cherishes, I'm reading from the Jewish Study Bible, the Lord cherishes the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly is, interesting word choice, doomed. There's no sense of timing here. It's not as though they're awaiting hell after they die. That's not the point of this kind of verse. It just means that these two kinds of people are choosing a path to walk, one which leads to a life that God cherishes, and of course everything that comes with that, and the other leading to, well, one of doom and failure in the opinion of the psalmist. Well, why is this situation the way it is? Many scholars think that Psalm 2 and Psalm 1 were at one point one psalm. Both of them do not have a superscription, and one flows right into the other. So let's test drive that idea. I think it works very well. Why is the way of the godly cherished and the way of the ungodly doomed? Well, we learn in Psalm 2 that God is going to do something to make this happen. And what we learn is in verse 6, Psalm 2:6, that God is going to set up his king for the people. Now again, in that worldview, understand how desperately you would want a protector over your family, your heritage, your fields, your clan, your tribe. The idea of America, for example, where we have a government that keeps us safe from enemies, is something we take for granted. Imagine living in a city-state where around every corner is a different king, a different city, or a different jurisdiction, and the idea of being protected was always part of the ancient mind. And so what God is saying, and again the timing of this seems to be when David himself becomes the king, that now comes this promise that God is going to establish as a permanent idea a king over his people. Okay, so what will this king do? There are three things mentioned in the psalm that I want to bring out here, and they will be part of a developing story. They're introduced here for the first time actually in Psalm 2, but they'll be followed through in much of the story to come. In 2:2 we hear of this term anointed. In Hebrew it's Mashiach, and it's a common term. It's 39 times in the Old Testament when a priest or a king, even Saul, was anointed. David was, of course. Someone who is chosen by God is smeared with oil, and that person is thus dedicated to serve God in a special way. The reason we bring it up now is because this king is called anointed in 2:2, meaning he has been specially chosen by God to sit in that place. Now, what's important is that in Psalm 2:2, there is no name for this king. So what seems to be happening is in the development of the story that we are following, God has now promised that there would be a king forever that he would have in charge of this cherished family. He would be chosen by God specially. There's a term in 2:7 that needs to be understood because it's fascinating, and that's the son idea. He will be my son. Well, of course, we're not talking a genealogical son, but in some way, Yahweh is choosing to call this king his son. What does the term son mean here? Let me quote from a good Bible dictionary. The term son here emphasizes belonging in a special way to God, being elected to perform in the service of God, and to specially experience God's love, mercy, and gifts. So notice it's not something that, again, needs to have a name to it. Various people could be this son, but it's a chosen position, it's an intimate position, and lastly, what's interesting is that this person is promised to inherit the nations. Now, why is that interesting? Well, for the first time, again, in the path of our story that we're following, we, of course, have heard that God is going to establish a nation through the family of Abraham. He has promised that way back in Genesis. And now we've seen that come to fruition in the choice of David. What is interesting about this word and that we know has not been a part of the story before this moment, but right now it now becomes a promise, is simply that plural nations. David was never promised to become the head of all the nations. In other words, what you have in this story, if you read closely, is the promise that someday, even beyond David, God will anoint someone who he will call his son, and he will rule over all the nations. Our job is to watch for that person.